the Ouachita National Forest, we have a feral hog problem. They're invasive, they're destructive, and they're smart. But the crew I was tracking last Tuesday wasn't hunting hogs. They were hunting sport. They had military-grade thermal scopes, suppressors, and catch dogs that cost more than my truck. They walked into these woods thinking they were the apex predators of the county. They were wrong, because by the time I found them, they had already met the thing that considers them an invasive species. In the Ouachita National Forest, darkness isn't just a lack of light, it's a physical weight. It presses down on the canopy, suffocating the hollows and twisting the scrub oak into shapes that don't belong in nature. Most people, even the ones who grew up here, are afraid of these woods after midnight. They stay in their trucks. They keep their high beams on. I don't. My name is Graves. I'm a federal game warden attached to the Special Operations Group. I don't write tickets for fishing without a license, and I don't lecture Boy Scouts about campfire safety. I hunt the things that think they're above the law. Usually, that means cartels growing pot in the National Preserve or meth cooks dumping toxic waste in the watershed. But tonight, I was hunting a different kind of parasite. We called them the Sounder. They were a crew of high-dollar poachers who had been treating federal land like their own private kill box for the last 6 months. These weren't locals looking to fill a freezer with venison. These were rich boys from Little Rock and Dallas who spent more on their optics than most folks here made in a year. They used suppressed AR-15s, military-grade thermal scopes, and GPS-collared catch dogs to run feral hogs into the ground. They didn't eat the meat. They just stacked the bodies and left them to rot. To them, the forest was just a playground. To me, they were an infection. I parked my government-issue Chevy Tahoe 3 miles out, backing it into a dense thicket of briars to hide the reflection of the glass. I killed the engine and stepped out into the humidity. The air was thick enough to chew, tasting of wet pine needles and impending rain. I didn't turn on a flashlight. Flashlights make you a target. I flipped down my PVS-14 monocular, and the world turned into a crisp, green phosphor landscape. I moved down Fire Road 12, a logging track that hadn't seen a legitimate vehicle in a decade. I was tracking them electronically. Earlier that week, I managed to clone the frequency of their dog collars. I could see their blips moving on the GPS unit strapped to my wrist. They were deep in Sector 4, a rugged stretch of limestone ridges and dense cedar breaks that was officially a no-go zone for civilians. The walk-in was quiet, too quiet. Usually the Ouachita is a noisy place at 200. You hear the chirping of tree frogs, the rustle of armadillos rooting in the leaves, the distant hoot of owls. Tonight, the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, just the sound of my own boots crunching softly on the gravel. It was the kind of silence that usually happens right before a tornado touches down, a vacuum of pressure waiting to be filled by violence. I reached the staging area 20 minutes later. I smelled the vehicles before I saw them. The sharp chemical scent of hot catalytic converters and unburnt diesel hung in the stagnant air. I slowed my pace, unholstering my sidearm, a Glock 20 loaded with 10 Mauto. It's a heavy round, good for stopping bears or engine blocks. I rounded the bend, and there they were. 2 modified Ford Raptors, matte black, lifted on 37-inch tires, sitting in a small clearing. They looked like spaceships landed in the mud. I approached from the blind side, keeping low, scanning the cabs with my night vision. Green ghosts of heat lingered on the hoods, telling me they had been parked for maybe an hour. The cabs were empty. "Federal Game Warden," I announced, my voice flat and projecting just enough to cover the clearing. "Step out if you're sleeping." Nothing, no movement, no startled waking. I holstered my weapon but kept the retention strap off. I walked up to the lead truck, a $90,000 beast with a winch bumper and enough lead light bars to illuminate a stadium. That's when I saw the stance. The truck was listing to the left. I looked down at the tires. The front driver's side tire wasn't just flat, it was destroyed. The thick, all-terrain rubber, reinforced with Kevlar sidewalls, hung in ribbons. I knelt, switching on a small, red-lens admin light to preserve my night vision. I ran a gloved finger along the rim. The damage was catastrophic, but it wasn't from the terrain. I've seen what jagged limestone does to a tire. It gouges and punctures. This was a clean, sweeping slice. It looked like someone had taken a machete and swung it with the force of a hydraulic press. The cut went through the tread, through the steel belt, and deep into the wheel well liner. I checked the rear tire, same thing slashed. I walked to the second truck. All 4 tires were gutted. I stood up, wiping the road grit from my gloves. A cold feeling started to settle in my gut, not fear, but a sharp, professional wariness. This wasn't animal damage. A bear bites and claws, it leaves a mess of punctures. A boar slashes upward with tusks, usually near the bottom. This was systematic disabling. Turf war, I whispered. It made sense. The sounder had been stepping on toes. Local hunters hated them. Maybe a rival crew had found their trucks, slashed the tires to strand them, and was waiting in the woods to teach them a lesson about respect. I looked at the ground. The mud around the trucks was a chaotic mess of boot prints. I recognized the tread patterns of expensive tactical boots, Solomons and Merrells. The prints were erratic, deep in the toes, sliding in the heels. They hadn't walked away from the trucks. They had run. I scanned the tree line again with the monocular. The green trees stood silent, watching. The GPS on my wrist pinged. The dogs were stationary about 400 yards up the ridge. The hunters were up there. And if my theory was right, they were probably getting the hell beat out of them by some locals with tire irons. I checked my radio. No signal. Deep in the hollows, I was on my own. I should have called it in. I should have driven back to the ridge to get reception and requested backup. But if this was a dispute turning violent, I didn't have 40 minutes to wait for a sheriff's deputy to wake up and drive out here. I adjusted my pack, tightened my grip on the Glock, and stepped past the ruined trucks. "Idiot city boys," I muttered, "picked the wrong woods." I stepped off the gravel and into the black timber, following the trail of panic into the dark. I thought I was walking into a fistfight. I thought I was the authority here. I didn't know yet that the tires weren't slashed by a knife. I didn't know that the silence in the woods wasn't out of respect for me. The forest wasn't holding its breath. It was hiding. I stepped off the gravel of Fire Road 12 and into the tree line, moving from the relative safety of the open track into the suffocating embrace of the deep woods. The transition was instant. One moment I was standing on man-made aggregate. The next, I was shin-deep in leaf litter and tangled briars that grabbed at my pant legs like desperate hands. I checked the Garmin unit strapped to my left wrist. The small LCD screen glowed with a faint backlight, displaying a topographic map of Sector 4. 3 red dots pulsed on the grid, the cloned signals from the poachers, catch dogs. They were stationary, grouped tightly together in a ravine about 400 yards to the northeast. Stationary dogs are usually a sign of one of 2 things. They've cornered a hog and are holding it at bay, or they're dead. I moved slowly, placing my feet with deliberate care. In this line of work, you learn to walk quietly, rolling your weight from the outside of the heel to the toe to minimize the crunch of dry leaves. I kept my Glock 20 at the low ready, the tritium sights glowing faintly in the gloom. My PVS-14 monocular turned the forest into a monochromatic tunnel of green phosphor. The trees looked like silent sentinels, their trunks glowing with residual heat, their branches interlaced overhead to block out the stars. The silence was the first thing that really bothered me. I've spent half my life in the Ouachita National Forest. I know its rhythm. At 200 in late summer, the woods should be a cacophony. There should be a wall of sound, crickets, katydids, tree frogs, the rustle of nocturnal foragers. It's a biological noise that screams life. But tonight the forest was dead. There was no wind to rattle the oak leaves, no insect hum. It was a vacuum, a heavy, oppressive stillness that pressed against my eardrums. It felt like walking into a room where an argument had just ended. The air was charged with a lingering violence. The local wildlife hadn't just gone quiet, they had gone to ground. They were hiding. I paused by a massive white oak, crouching to scan the terrain ahead. Through the night vision, the woods appeared flat and deceptive, depth perception flattened by the single tube. I listened. Nothing. Just the blood rushing in my own ears and the shallow rasp of my breathing. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I wasn't talking to the poachers. I was talking to the forest itself. I pushed forward, following the digital breadcrumbs on my wrist. The terrain grew steeper, dropping off into a limestone drainage that channeled water during the spring rains. The mud here was slick, churned up by the passage of heavy bodies. I saw the boot prints again. They were frantic. The stride length was elongated, full sprints. I saw where one of the hunters had slipped, his heel gouging a 2-foot trench in the clay before he regained his footing. He wasn't stopping to check his GPS. He wasn't tracking prey. He was running for his life. I descended into the ravine, the temperature dropping 10 degrees as the cold air settled in the low ground. The smell hit me before I saw the source. It wasn't the metallic scent of copper I usually associate with a crime scene. It was the smell of wet fur and bowel, the smell of an animal that died in terror. I saw a flash of orange reflective material caught in a patch of scrub cedar ahead. I slowed my approach, sweeping the area with my weapon. If this was a turf war, the rival crew could be waiting over the body, using it as bait. I checked the high ground. Clear. I checked the thermal signature. Cold. I moved into the cedar brake. The dog was a Dogo Argentino, a massive, white-muscled breed built for one thing, catching and holding 300-pound wild boars. It was wearing a heavy-duty cut vest, a thick collar and chest protector made of Kevlar and ballistic nylon, designed to stop the razor-sharp tusks of a hog. These vests are expensive, tough, and usually bulletproof against anything short of a rifle round. The vest was shredded. I knelt beside the carcass, keeping my eyes moving, scanning the perimeter. The dog lay on its side, its eyes wide and glazed, reflecting the faint ambient light. I holstered my weapon and pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves. I examined the vest. The thick nylon straps had been snapped. The Kevlar weave was ripped open, the fibers frayed outward. I looked at the wounds. A wild boar kills with its tusks. It slashes upward, trying to sever the femoral artery or disembowel the dog from below. The wounds are jagged, linear cuts. A bear kills with bites and swatting force, leaving puncture wounds and crushing trauma. This dog hadn't been slashed or crushed. It had been disassembled. The front left leg was dislocated, pulled completely out of the socket with such force that the heavy muscle groups of the shoulder had torn like wet paper. The ribcage was cracked open, not from impact, but from leverage. I stared at the damage, my brain trying to process the physics required to do this. To pull a leg off a 100-pound dog requires hundreds of pounds of torque. It requires grip. It requires opposable thumbs. I looked at the mud around the body. The ground was torn up, a chaotic mix of dog prints and those massive, elongated bipedal tracks I had seen at the trucks. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. The dog had been caught mid-stride. Whatever killed it had grabbed it, pinned it, and ripped it apart in seconds. There were no defensive wounds on the dog's muzzle. It hadn't even had time to bite back. I stood up, peeling off the gloves. The silence of the ravine felt heavier now. The turf war theory was evaporating with every second I stood there. Men kill dogs with bullets. They shoot them to silence them. They don't do this. I looked at my GPS unit. 2 red dots remained, about 100 yards further up the draw. I drew my Glock again, but the weight of the polymer frame felt insignificant. I had 15 rounds of 10. Against a poacher with a rifle, I liked my odds. Against something that could snap Kevlar straps like twine. I keyed my shoulder mic, trying the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Alpha. Do you copy?" Static, white noise. The geography of the ravine was blocking the signal completely. I looked up the draw, into the deeper darkness where the other two dots were waiting. I should have turned back. I should have hiked to the ridge, called in the state police, and waited for daylight. But the dots were stationary. And if there was a chance, however slim, that one of those hunters was still alive up there, I couldn't leave. I adjusted my grip on the pistol and stepped over the broken body of the dog, moving deeper into the kill box. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. I left the broken remains of the Dogo Argentino where it lay, pushing deeper into the ravine. The silence of the woods felt heavier now, charged with a specific kind of violence that I usually only felt at murder scenes. The air was stagnant, holding the scent of wet pine and that underlying, coppery tang that I was trying hard to ignore. I stopped about 50 yards up the draw. The terrain was rising sharply, turning into a steep ridge of limestone and scrub oak. If I were a poacher on the run, that ridge was where I'd go. It offered the high ground and a clear line of sight back down the trail. I stowed the PVS-14 night vision unit. Green phosphor is great for navigation, but it doesn't distinguish between a man in camouflage and a tree trunk. For that, you need thermal. I pulled the FLIR Scout monocular from my vest pouch and brought it to my eye. The world shifted from grainy green to a stark spectrum of grays, whites, and blacks. Thermal doesn't care about camouflage. It detects the infrared energy radiating from a living body. If there was a mouse shivering under a leaf 100 yards away, I would see it. I scanned the ridge line, moving the optic slowly from left to right. The trees were cold, rendering as dark gray skeletons against the slightly warmer night sky. The rocks were black voids. Then I saw the heat. High up in a massive oak tree, about 70 yards away, 3 bright white shapes burned against the gray background. They were grouped tightly together, positioned on a large branch or a platform. "Got you," I whispered. It was a tree stand, a permanent hunting blind illegally built on federal land. It made perfect sense. The hunters had fled the trucks, scrambled up the ridge, and climbed into the stand to wait out the threat. They were probably watching me right now through their own scopes, fingers on triggers. I moved to the cover of a thick cedar tree, putting the trunk between me and their line of fire. I checked my Glock, one in the chamber, full magazine. "Federal Game Warden," I shouted, my voice booming in the quiet draw. "I know you're in the stand. Come down with your hands empty." I waited. The thermal image showed no movement. The 3 white shapes remained perfectly still. "I said come down," I yelled again. "This is your only warning. Do not make a mistake you can't walk away from." Silence, not a rustle, not a whisper. I frowned, watching the screen. Usually when you corner a crew like this, you see panic. You see hands go up or you see them shifting position to aim. You don't see statues. I zoomed the optic in. The resolution sharpened. Something was wrong with the heat signatures. A living human body glows white-hot in the center, the chest and head, where the blood flow is strongest. The extremities are usually a shade cooler, a light gray. These signatures were fading. The bright white core I expected to see in their chests was dulling, turning a mottled gray. The heat wasn't contained. It looked like it was dissipating into the air around them, and they were elongated, stretched. I lowered the optic for a second, trusting my naked eyes to scan the dark, then brought it back up. The dread in my stomach turned into a hard, cold knot. "Cover me," I whispered to no one, and broke from the cedar tree. I moved fast, closing the distance, keeping my weapon trained on the tree. I flanked wide, coming up the ridge from the side to stay out of the direct line of fire. I climbed the limestone scree, my boots sliding on the loose rock until I was directly beneath the oak. I didn't need the thermal anymore. I could smell it. The metallic scent of blood was overpowering here, mixed with the raw, earthy smell of opened entrails. It was the smell of a butcher shop floor after a long shift. I clicked on my weapon-mounted tactical light. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the branches above. I nearly dropped the gun. There was a tree stand up there, a metal platform ratcheted to the trunk, but the men weren't standing on it. They were hanging from it. 3 men dressed in expensive Sitka camouflage were suspended by their ankles from the underside of the platform. Thick nylon rope, the kind used for hoisting game, was knotted around their boots. They swayed gently in the dead air, turning slowly in the beam of my light. But it was what had been done to them that made my mind reel. They had been field-dressed. It was surgical. A single, precise incision ran from the sternum to the pelvis on each man. Their chest cavities had been cracked open, the ribs pulled back. The internal organs had been removed cleanly, efficiently, and were gone. There was no blood on the ground directly beneath them because they had been drained hours ago, or perhaps elsewhere. They hung there, hollowed out, their arms dangling loose toward the forest floor, swaying like sides of beef in a curring locker. I stepped back, fighting the bile rising in my throat. I've seen dead bodies. I've seen what cartels do to informants. I've seen what a shotgun does at close range. But this was mocking. This was exactly how a hunter treats a deer after the kill. You hoist it up. You bleed it. You remove the organs to cool the meat. You prepare it for transport. I raised the thermal monocular again, my hand shaking slightly. I looked at the bodies. The false heat I had seen from down the hill wasn't life. It was the last residual warmth of the muscle tissue fatting into the cold night air. The extremities were already black on the screen. The cores were a dying gray. They had been alive when I found the trucks. The tire tracks, the mud, the panic, that was fresh. Which meant this had happened fast. In the 20 minutes it took me to hike from the road to the ravine, something had caught 3 armed men, hoisted them 20 feet into the air, and processed them like game animals. And it had done it silently. I looked at the faces of the men as they spun slowly in the light. Their eyes were open, frozen in masks of absolute primal terror. They hadn't just been killed, they had been harvested. I killed the light, plunging myself back into the darkness. I felt exposed. I felt small. The thermal monocular in my hand felt like a toy. I stood under the swaying bodies of the apex predators of the county, and for the first time in my career, I knew exactly what the deer feels when the twig snaps. The heat was fatting, but the thing that took it was still warm, and it was close. I forced my eyes away from the swaying shapes above. Panic is a luxury I couldn't afford. If I let the horror of what was hanging in that oak tree take root in my mind, I would freeze. And in these woods, freezing meant joining them. I needed data. I needed to understand the sequence of events. I took a deep breath, tasting the copper and the pine, and forced my brain into cop mode. I lowered my tactical light from the canopy to the forest floor. The moment the beam hit the ground, the story changed. I wasn't standing at a murder scene. I was standing on a battlefield. The leaf litter was almost invisible beneath a carpet of brass. Hundreds of spent shell casings glinted in the harsh white light, scattered in wide, chaotic arcs. I knelt, picking up a handful. They were warm to the touch, or maybe my hands were just cold. 5.56 NATO, Lake City brass, high-quality ammunition. I looked at the spread. This wasn't the work of a single shooter firing a few defensive rounds. This was sustained, cyclic fire. I counted at least 3 distinct piles of brass, spaced about 5 yards apart. The 3 men had formed a defensive triangle. They had stood back to back, covering every sector, and they had unloaded everything they had. I moved the light to the trees surrounding the clearing. The trunks of the scrub oaks and pines were shredded. White wood shone through the dark bark where hundreds of bullets had impacted. Sap was weeping from the wounds in the timber. I traced the trajectory of the damage. The bullets weren't grouped. They were sprayed. There were impacts 5 feet up, impacts at ground level, impacts 20 feet high in the branches. "Panic fire," I whispered. But that didn't make sense. I looked back at the brass. These weren't rookie shooters. They were using high-end AR platforms. I found an empty Magpul PMAG dropped in the mud, likely during a reload. You don't reload in a panic unless you have muscle memory. These guys knew how to run their guns. So why couldn't they hit the target? I walked over to where the leader's rifle lay in the dirt. A Daniel Defense MK-18 with a suppressor and a Trigican thermal scope mounted on top. The rifle was empty, the bolt locked back. I picked it up. It was heavy, coated in mud and pine needles. I wiped the lens of the thermal scope and brought it to my eye. Even with the electronics off, the glass was crystal clear. This was the piece of the puzzle that made my blood run cold. These men had thermal optics. In the pitch black of the forest, thermal turns night into day. It highlights anything with a pulse in bright, glowing white. You can't hide from it. Camouflage doesn't work. Shadows don't work. If a mouse runs across a log at 100 yards, a thermal scope sees it. If they were attacked by a bear, they would have seen it coming from a mile away. They would have put 30 rounds into its chest before it got within smelling distance. If they were attacked by a rival crew, they would have seen the body heat of the attackers moving through the trees. They would have had the advantage. But the trees around me told a different story. The erratic spray of bullets, the sheer volume of fire, the desperate 360-degree spread. They saw it, I knew they saw it. They saw something coming at them through those thermal scopes, but they couldn't track it. I looked at the bullet holes in a hickory tree to my left. There was a tight cluster of 3 hits, then a streak of impacts traversing wildly to the right, rising 10 feet in the air, then slashing back down to the dirt. They were chasing a ghost. Whatever killed them moved faster than they could traverse their weapons. It had closed the distance on 3 armed men, moving through a hail of high-velocity lead, and it hadn't just survived. It had gotten close enough to disarm them. I looked back up at the bodies swaying in the silence. They hadn't been taken by surprise. They hadn't been ambushed in their sleep. They had stood their ground, armed with the best technology money could buy, and they had fought a war against something that moved too fast to die. I dropped the empty rifle back into the mud. My own Glock 20 felt like a paperweight in my holster. I had 15 rounds. They had fired hundreds. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The silence in the woods wasn't because the fight was over. It was because the cleanup had begun. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was just the next witness. And based on the temperature of the brass in my hand, the thing that won this firefight wasn't far away. It was probably watching me figure it out. I turned my back on the swaying bodies and the carpet of brass, forcing my focus back to the immediate perimeter. The logic of the scene dictated that everyone was dead. The volume of fire, the surgical aftermath, the silence, it all pointed to a total wipeout. But in my line of work, you don't assume, you verify. I raised the thermal monocular again, sweeping the ground level this time. I wasn't looking for the fatting gray of a corpse. I was looking for the bright, white-hot bloom of life. The woods were a mosaic of cold blues and blacks, broken only by the vertical lines of the timber. I scanned a thicket of briars to my left. Cold. I scanned the drainage ditch where the shell casings had rolled. Cold. Then I saw it. About 20 yards past the kill zone, a massive upturned root wad from a fallen sweetgum tree created a small cavern in the earth. Deep inside that hollow, glowing like an ember in ash, was a heat signature. It was small, curled into a fetal ball, but the core was bright white. It was shivering violently, the heat pulsing in rhythm with the tremors. I didn't call out. I didn't want to alert whatever had cleared the tree stand that I had found its leftovers. I holstered the monocular and brought the Glock up, moving in a low crouch. I flanked the root wad, approaching from the side to avoid the fatal funnel of the opening. My boots sank into the soft mulch, silent as a whisper. I reached the edge of the wood and listened. I could hear the teeth chattering. It was a rapid, clicking sound, like dice rattling in a cup. "Federal Game Warden," I hissed, keeping my voice low and hard. "Show me your hands, do it now." The chattering stopped. A gasp of air was sucked in, sharp and wet. "Don't shoot," a voice croaked. It was barely a human sound. It was the sound of a man who had screamed until his vocal cords bled. "Hands," I repeated. "Drop the weapon and crawl out." A rifle slid out of the hole first. It was another Daniel Defense AR-15, expensive and muddy. It clattered onto the roots. Then a pair of hands appeared, trembling so hard the fingers were blurring. I reached down, grabbed the collar of his expensive Sitka jacket, and hauled him out into the open. He hit the ground and scrambled backward, crab-walking through the mud until his back hit the log. He wasn't fighting me. He was trying to put me between him and the dark woods. I shined my tactical light in his face. I recognized him. He was the one I'd seen in the surveillance photos back at the office, the money man behind the sounder. He was usually smiling in the pictures, holding up a dead hog or a rack of antlers with the arrogance of a man who owned the world. Now he looked like a child. His face was smeared with mud and tear streaks. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the irises. He had wet himself. The dark stain on his camouflage pants was visible even in the low light. "You're under arrest," I said, keeping the light in his eyes. "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right." "Yes," he interrupted, lunging forward. He grabbed my boot. "Yes, arrest me, please." I stepped back, keeping the gun trained on his chest. "Get on your knees, hands behind your head." He obeyed instantly. He interlaced his fingers behind his head and looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "Take me to jail," he sobbed. "Take me to federal prison. I don't care, just get me out of here. Put me in the truck. Please, officer, put me in the cage." I've arrested men for poaching before. They usually argue, they lawyer up. They try to bribe you, they never beg for the handcuffs. "Who hit you?" I asked, scanning the tree line over his shoulder. "Was it the cartel growers from Sector 9? Locals?" The man laughed. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that cracked in the middle. "Cartel," he wheezed. "You think men did this?" "I saw the brass," I said. "I saw the tree stand. You guys put up a hell of a fight. Who were you shooting at?" He shook his head violently, his eyes squeezing shut as if trying to block out a memory. "We couldn't track them," he whispered. "We had the thermals. We had the night vision, but they knew how the scopes worked." I lowered the light slightly, crouching down to look him in the eye. "What do you mean, they knew?" "The dogs," he stammered. "We sent the catch dogs out, 3 of them, best tracking dogs in the state. They went into the brush and the noise stopped, just stopped." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Then we saw the heat signature coming back," he said. "On the thermal scope. It was low to the ground, 4 legs. We thought the dogs were coming back." He opened his eyes. They were haunted, staring past me into the black timber. "It wasn't the dogs," he whispered. "What was it?" I asked, the skin on my arms prickling. "It was wearing them," he said. The words hung in the silence between us, heavier than the humidity. "What?" "It held the dog in front of its body," the poacher whispered, his voice trembling. "It used the dog's body heat to mask its own signature. It walked right up to the tree line carrying the dead dog like a shield. We didn't shoot because we thought it was our animal returning. It baited us. It waited until it was 20 yards away, and then it threw the carcass at us." He started to sob again, rocking back and forth. It threw the dog 30 feet in the air, right into the stand, and while we were screaming, the others flanked us. I stood up slowly. The tactical implications of what he just said hit me like a sledgehammer. Animals ambush, animals stalk, but using a thermal shield, understanding that the men wouldn't fire at a friendly heat signature, using a projectile to create a distraction for a flanking maneuver. That wasn't instinct, that was tactics. I looked at the survivor, huddled in the mud, begging for a prison cell because it was the only place he felt safe. "Get up," I said, my voice tight. "We're leaving." I grabbed his arm to haul him to his feet, but he froze, his body going rigid. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. From deep in the ravine back near the trucks came a sound. It wasn't a howl, it wasn't a growl. It was the sound of metal tearing. It was the sound of a hood being ripped off a Ford Raptor. They weren't just killing the competition. They were making sure no one left the arena. The sound of the trucks being torn apart echoed up the ravine like the screams of dying animals. Metal shrieked as panels were ripped free, followed by the heavy, dull crunch of safety glass shattering. They were thorough. They weren't just disabling the vehicles, they were dismantling them. I hauled the survivor to his feet. He was dead weight, his legs rubbery with shock, his eyes fixed on the darkness down the hill. "Move," I ordered, shoving him toward the ridge line. "We can't go back to the road." "They're cutting us off," he stammered, stumbling over a root. "They know we're here, they're circling." I didn't answer him. I knew he was right. The destruction of the trucks was a containment measure. Whatever was out there understood that humans needed machines to escape. Take away the machines, and we were just slow, soft protein moving through the dark. We scrambled up the limestone scree, putting distance between us and the kill zone. I kept my weapon trained on our six, scanning the shadows, but my primary sense was hearing. I was waiting for a twig snap, a rustle of leaves, anything that would give away a pursuit. But the woods remained terrifyingly silent. Then the sound hit us. It didn't come from the trucks. It came from everywhere at once, rolling over the ridges like a fog. It started as a howl, deep and resonant, but it twisted in the middle. It broke into a strange, mechanical chittering, like wet stones grinding together, before peaking into a high-pitched shriek that sounded like a steam whistle welding itself shut. I stopped dead. I've heard coyotes yip. I've heard cougars scream. I've heard wolves in the northern territories. This was none of those. This was the sound of something that had learned to mimic a wolf, but got the frequency wrong. The survivor collapsed. He didn't trip, his legs just gave out. He curled into a ball in the dirt, covering his ears with his muddy hands. "That's it," he sobbed. "That's the signal, they're moving." I looked down at him, then out at the black expanse of the forest. The signal, a migration call. I remembered the briefings from the state police about unidentified wildlife moving south from Missouri. I remembered the blurry trail cam photos of things that stood on two legs in the Ozarks. We thought it was folklore. We thought it was meth-induced hysteria. We were wrong. "Get up," I hissed, grabbing his collar. "If you stay here, you die." "I can't," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Don't you get it? They aren't hunting anymore. They're mustering." I let go of him. He was useless. Panic had severed the connection between his brain and his legs. If I was going to survive this, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I reached for my thermal monocular. My hand brushed against the survivor's discarded rifle, the one I had left in the mud. I looked at the expensive thermal scope mounted on top of it. It was dark. For a second, I had assumed the batteries were dead. That's why he had abandoned it. That's why he had huddled in the hole blindly. But as I looked at the man curled on the ground, shaking so hard his teeth rattled, a cold realization washed over me. I realized then that the hunter's thermal scope hadn't run out of batteries. He had turned it off. He had turned it off because he was terrified of what he was seeing. In just a second, I'm going to reveal exactly what stepped out of that tree line and surrounded us. But first, if you have the stomach for the stories the authorities try to bury, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. The sheriff deletes these files. We broadcast them. Don't miss the next report. Now, let's see what the Alpha brought with him. I lifted my own FLIR monocular to my eye. I took a breath, steadied my hand against a sapling, and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. The calibration scale adjusted, turning the black void of the forest into a grayscale reality. I scanned the ridge to the north, clear. I scanned the drainage to the south, clear. Then I swung the optic to the east, toward the dense tree line we had just come from. The woods lit up. They weren't hiding behind trees. They weren't crouching in the brush. They were standing in the open, forming a perfect semicircle about 50 yards away. There wasn't one heat signature. There were six. 6 bright white forms burning against the cold gray background. They were massive, standing upright on 2 legs. Their shoulders broad and hunched. The heat blooming from their chests was intense, indicating massive hearts pumping blood for a sprint. And they were organized. The 2 on the flanks were slightly ahead, closing the net. The 3 in the center were stationary, watching, but it was the one in the middle that made my breath catch in my throat. It was bigger than the others, brighter on the thermal screen, and across its chest, the heat signature was broken by a grid pattern of cold scar tissue, thick, non-vascular keloids that didn't hold heat like the rest of the body. The survivor was right. They weren't hunting, they were herding us. I lowered the monocular, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the dark tree line with my naked eyes. I couldn't see them. I couldn't hear them. But I knew they were there, 6 monsters standing in a tactical phalanx, waiting for the order to advance. 6 of them, I whispered, the number feeling heavy on my tongue. The survivor stopped crying. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant. "The pack," he whispered. "They brought the whole pack." I reholstered the thermal and drew my Glock. 15 rounds, 6 targets. The math didn't work. Then the center creature, the one with the scarred chest, took a step forward. Even from 50 yards away, I felt the vibration of its footfall in the ground. The migration was over. The occupation had begun. I hauled the survivor to his feet, my grip on his collar tight enough to bruise. He was a dead weight of trembling limbs and wet camouflage, but I slammed him against the rough bark of a hickory tree and pinned him there. "Listen to me," I hissed, my face inches from his. "I have 15 rounds. There are 6 of them. If you curl up in a ball again, I will leave you here for them. Do you understand?" He nodded, his eyes wide and unseeing, saliva bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "They're circling," he whispered. "They're cutting the angles." "Then watch your sector," I ordered, spinning him around so his back was to the tree and his eyes were facing the south ridge. "If you see movement, you scream. You don't freeze, you scream." I turned my back to him, facing the north. We were a 2-man defensive perimeter in a sea of darkness. I held the Glock 20 at the high ready, my thumb riding the safety of the weapon-mounted light. I didn't turn it on yet. Light is information, and I wasn't giving it away for free. The silence of the woods had returned, but it was thinner now, stretched tight over the impending violence. Then the leaves rustled to my left. It was a deliberate sound, heavy, distinct. I snapped the pistol toward the noise, depressing the pressure pad. The tactical light blasted a cone of 1,000 lumens into the brush. Nothing, just a swaying cedar branch and the empty blackness of the forest. Snap! A twig broke to my right, hard. I swung the weapon 90 degrees, chasing the sound. The beam swept across the trunks of the oaks. Again, nothing. "They're bounding," I whispered, the realization settling in my gut like cold lead. This wasn't animal instinct. A wolf pack surrounds and collapses. A bear charges. These things were using infantry tactics. They were using bounding overwatch. One element made noise to draw my attention, and my weapon, while the other element moved silently in the blind spot I had just created. I remembered the briefing from the survivor's interrogation. It baited us. They were testing my reaction time. They were measuring how fast I could traverse the gun. They were learning the weapon's reach. "To your left," the poacher screamed, his voice shredding into a high-pitched wail. I spun, not bothering with the light this time. I fired at the shadow detaching itself from a sweetgum tree 20 yards away. Bang! The 10 round cracked through the air, hitting the tree with a solid thwack. The shadow didn't drop. It didn't yelp. It simply melted back into the darkness with a fluidity that shouldn't be possible for something that size. It had shown itself on purpose. It wanted me to shoot. It wanted me to empty the magazine at shadows so it could walk in when the slide locked back. "They're getting closer," the survivor sobbed. "I can hear them breathing." I could hear it too, a wet, rattling respiration coming from multiple directions. They were closing the net. They weren't running, they were walking. They knew we had nowhere to go. The trucks were dead. The radio was dead. We were just waiting for the checkmate. I looked at the Glock in my hand. It was a fine weapon for law enforcement. Against this, it was a noise maker. I needed a force multiplier. I needed something that could hit 6 targets at once. My hand brushed the pouch on the left side of my tactical vest. As a game warden in bear country, we carry specialized, less lethal deterrents. Usually, it's bear spray. But when you're dealing with aggressive sows or habituated boars that refuse to leave a campground, sometimes you need something louder. I carried a combined tactical systems 7290 flashbang. It's a non-bursting diversionary device. It produces a deafening 175 decibel report and a blinding 8 million candela flash. It's designed to disorient armed felons in barricaded rooms. Against a creature with night vision sensitive enough to see a mouse in the dark, it would be like staring into the sun. "Cover your eyes," I roared. The poacher looked at me, confused, paralyzed by fear. "Close your eyes and open your mouth," I screamed, grabbing his shoulder and forcing his head down. "Do it." He slumped down, burying his face in his hands. I ripped the CTS 7290 from the pouch. I pulled the safety pin. The spoon sprang free with a metallic ping. I didn't throw it at a specific target. I threw it straight up, lobbing it high into the air above the clearing. An airburst would maximize the radius. "Fire in the hole." I squeezed my eyes shut, clamped my hands over my ears, and turned away. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the canister tumbling through the leaves. Boom! Even with my eyes closed and my hands over my ears, the world turned white. The concussion wave hit my chest like a physical punch, sucking the air out of the clearing. The sound wasn't a noise. It was a pressure change that rattled my teeth. Then came the scream. It wasn't human. It was a chorus of agony. 6 distinct voices shrieked in unison. It was the sound of sensitive retinas burning out, of heightened auditory nerves being overloaded by a sonic hammer. The woods erupted with the sound of crashing timber and thrashing bodies. I opened my eyes. My vision was swimming with purple spots, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. But I could see them. In the chaotic aftermath of the flash, the thermal camouflage had failed. Or maybe they were just writhing in too much pain to hide. I saw massive, hulking shapes staggering in the brush. One was clawing at its eyes. Another had run straight into a tree, dazed. The discipline was gone. The phalanx was broken. "Move," I yelled, grabbing the survivor by his collar and hauling him up. "While they're blind, move." We ran. We didn't tactically retreat. We sprinted into the gap the flashbang had created, plunging into the dark timber while the apex predators of the Ouachita Forest screamed in the dark behind us. We ran until our lungs burned like we'd inhaled broken glass. The woods were a blur of whipping branches and treacherous roots, illuminated only by the erratic strobe of my tactical light as I swung my arms. The ringing in my ears from the flashbang had faded to a dull, throbbing ache, but it was loud enough to mask the sound of pursuit. That was the problem. I couldn't hear them anymore. The survivor, the money man behind the sounder crew, was failing. He stumbled, his expensive boots catching on a vine, and went down hard. He hit the dirt with a wet thud and didn't try to get up. He just curled into the fetal position, sobbing, his mind broken by the sensory overload of the last 10 minutes. "Get up," I rasped, grabbing his vest. "We are not clear." "Leave me," he wheezed, clutching the dirt. "They're everywhere, I can feel them." I spun around, raising my Glock 20, sweeping the darkness behind us. The flashbang had bought us maybe 60 seconds of confusion. That time was up. The woods had gone silent again. The chaotic shrieking caused by the concussion grenade had stopped. The thrashing in the brush had ceased. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the silence of a predator that has regained its composure. Then the trees parted. It didn't charge. It didn't leap. It walked out of the darkness with a slow, terrifying deliberation. It was the Alpha. I had seen the heat signature on the thermal scope, but seeing it in the wash of my tactical light was something my brain refused to process. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, a tower of matted black fur and corded muscle. It breathed in heavy, wet rattles, steam venting from its jaws in the cool night air. But it was the chest that drew my eye. Across the massive pectorals, the fur was burned away. Thick, shiny ropes of keloid scar tissue formed a grid pattern on the gray skin. Iron Creek. The survivor was right. This wasn't a local cryptid. This was a fugitive. It had walked through a high-voltage perimeter to get here, and the scars were its war paint. I raised the Glock, aligning the tritium sights on the center of that scarred chest. My hand was steady, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with absolute certainty, that 15 rounds of 10 would just annoy it. "Don't move," I whispered, though I knew it didn't understand English. Or maybe it did. The Alpha stopped 10 feet away. It looked down at me. Its eyes were amber, intelligent, and devoid of fear. It didn't snarl, it didn't roar, it just studied me. It looked at the badge on my chest. It looked at the weapon in my hand. Then it looked past me. Its gaze locked onto the poacher shivering in the dirt behind my boots. The man whimpered, a high, thin sound of pure despair. The Alpha took a step forward. I tensed, my finger taking up the slack on the trigger. "Back off," I yelled. The creature ignored me. It didn't even blink. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace, closing the distance in 2 strides. I braced for the impact, expecting to be swatted aside like a fly. But the blow never came. The Alpha moved around me. It stepped within inches of my shoulder. I could smell the rot and the ozone on its fur. I could feel the heat radiating from its body like a furnace. It was close enough that I could have reached out and touched the scars on its flank. It wasn't interested in me. I watched, frozen, as the massive hand reached down. It grabbed the poacher by the back of his tactical vest. The man screamed, but it was cut short as he was hoisted into the air with one hand, as effortlessly as I would lift a bag of groceries. The poacher kicked and flailed, his boots drumming uselessly against the creature's legs. He dropped his rifle. He dropped his dignity. He was just prey now. The Alpha held him there, suspended in the beam of my light. It looked at the man, sniffing the air. It smelled the gunpowder on him. It smelled the dogs on him. It recognized the specific scent of the enemy that had come into its woods with thermal scopes and suppressors. Then the Alpha turned its head and looked back at me. For a long, agonizing second, we made eye contact. The creature's expression wasn't rage, it was recognition. I was the warden. I was the one who enforced the boundaries. I wasn't hunting it. I was just patrolling the same territory. It gave a low, rumbling huff, a sound that vibrated in my chest. It was a dismissal, a pass. Professional courtesy. The alpha turned and walked back into the darkness, dragging the screaming man with it. It didn't run. It didn't hide. It simply carried its prize back into the deep timber to finish what the poachers had started. I stood there, weapon raised, aiming at nothing. The screams of the man faded quickly, swallowed by the density of the forest. Then there was a wet, crunching sound, and the woods went silent again. I lowered the gun. My knees felt like water. I looked down at the ground where the poacher had been. His rifle lay in the mud. I was alone. The pack had what they wanted. They had cleared the competition. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. I didn't turn my back until I hit the gravel of the fire road. The woods were theirs now. I was just a guest, and my visa had almost expired. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. I didn't run. You don't run from something that just let you live. It shows a lack of respect. I walked the center of Fire Road 12, my boots scuffing heavily on the gravel, my weapon holstered but the retention strap unclipped. The woods were quiet again, but the silence had changed texture. Before, it was the silence of a held breath, a tense, predatory waiting game. Now it was the silence of a church after the service has ended. The ritual was complete. The intruders had been removed. The natural order, however twisted it might be, had been restored. I didn't look at my thermal monocular. I didn't scan the tree line. I knew they were there, paralleling my movement, escorting me to the boundary line. I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck, a physical weight that pressed between my shoulder blades. The alpha had given me a pass, but passes can be revoked. I reached the trailhead 40 minutes later. My Chevy Tahoe was where I had left it, backed into the briars, but it wasn't alone. A black SUV sat idling on the gravel turnout, its parking lights casting an amber glow on the wet stones. I recognized the silhouette immediately. It was a sleek, unmarked unit, heavier than a standard patrol vehicle. Sheriff Caldwell was leaning against the hood, a cigarette burning in his hand. The cherry of the tobacco glowed bright orange in the gloom, a tiny lighthouse in a sea of darkness. I stopped 10 feet away. I didn't reach for my badge. Caldwell knew who I was. He knew why I was here. And judging by the mud on his tires, he knew what was out there. He took a long drag, exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the humid air, and nodded at me. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a double shift, but the kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets that are too heavy for one man. "Warden," he said. His voice was gravel and low. "Sheriff," I replied. He looked at my uniform. He looked at the mud caked on my knees, the tear in my tactical vest, and the empty pouch where my flashbang used to be. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew the answer. "Dispatch got a call about shots fired," Caldwell said, flicking ash onto the ground. "Sounded like a war zone for a minute there. Then it got quiet." "It was an equipment malfunction," I said. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. Caldwell tilted his head, studying me. "We had reports of a poaching crew operating in this sector. High-end gear, thermal scopes, the works. We called them the Sounder." He paused, looking past me into the black throat of the forest. "Did you find them?" I followed his gaze. Somewhere back there in the deep ravine, the alpha was doing what alpha predators do. There would be no bodies to recover. There would be no trial. The forest recycles everything. "I found their trucks," I said carefully. "Slash marks on the tires, looked like vandalism." "And the men?" Caldwell asked. I met his eyes. In the amber light of the parking lamps, I saw the same look the alpha had given me. It was the look of a man who understands the boundaries. "Nature took its course," I said. Caldwell didn't blink. He took one last drag of his cigarette, dropped the butt, and ground it out with the heel of his boot. "Figures," he grunted. "Bears are getting aggressive this year, territory disputes." Yeah, I said, territory. He pushed himself off the hood of his truck and opened the driver's side door. The interior light flooded the gravel, brief and blinding. I'll have a tow crew come out for the abandoned vehicles in the morning, Caldwell said. I'll file the report. Lost in the woods. Happens every hunting season. He paused with one foot in the cab and looked back at me. Go home, Graves. Stay out of Sector 4 for a while. Let it settle. Sheriff, I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Where did they come from? The ones with the scars? Caldwell froze. He didn't look at me. He looked at the dashboard. North, he said softly. They moved down from Missouri, Iron Creek, and they didn't come here to hide, Warden. They came here to rule. He slammed the door. The black SUV pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires, taillights fatting into the mist until they were swallowed by the night. I stood alone at the trailhead. I reached into my vest pocket and pulled out my field notebook. It contained the coordinates of the kill site. It contained the description of the swaying bodies, the forensic analysis of the slashed tires, and the sketch I had made of the tracks. I pulled out my lighter. I flicked the wheel, shielding the flame with my cupped hand. I held it to the corner of the notebook. The paper caught, curling black and orange. I watched the evidence burn. I watched the logic and the law turn to ash and float away on the wind. There was no point in filing a report. The federal government has jurisdiction over the land, the timber, and the water. We regulate the deer limits and the fishing seasons. We draw lines on maps and call it control. But as the fire consumed the last page of my notes, I looked back at the tree line one last time. The woods were pitch black, silent, but I could feel the presence. I could feel the alpha waiting for me to leave. I dropped the burning notebook into a puddle and turned toward my truck. The maps were wrong. This wasn't public land anymore. We were just the caretakers during the day. The night belonged to the new management.